with another warm up before our final stretch. We're very happy and very honored. Also, Teea was able to join us today and give our first keynote for the conference. Tea's work has been really impactful, joining work within philosophy and just transitions, and especially focusing on food. So really pioneering work in this field for us and opening this up to a broader audience. So Teea is assistant professor in Jyväskylä.
Yes. You will find her with that.
In Finland, and yes, I'll just leave it to you. And you've also been actually, were you president in EurSafe or?
I'm the secretary.
Secretary, yes.
So happy to answer any questions on that, but let's save that to the wine and food.
Yes. And I see you're calling us to meet again soon.
Yes, the official advertisement part. Thanks, Sophia.
Yes.
It's just reset the timing so that, and please let me know when I have used 30 minutes.
Okay.
So that I know not to hurry at you. It's such a great honor and pleasure to be able to be here today talking about making sense of Just Agrifood Transitions. Such perfect timing. This is based on a 6-year project that ended 1 month ago. So I have had a little bit of healthy distance to digest things, but anyways, there's a lot to draw on. I hope to make it at least from some particular perspective today, which is precisely sort of findings and lessons from a 6-year transdisciplinary journey, and especially also a philosopher's place in there. I myself have both social sciences and philosophy research background and role in the project, but this is today a little bit more on the philosophy, ethics, normativity and tensions. We could have had some additional body energy for that.
Yes.
And acknowledgements to the whole Just Food Research Consortium. It was more than 30 members. I was the only philosopher in there, at least in the beginning. Outline. I'm going to talk about what I mean by the mess. Then I go to making sense of the mess, and then finally navigating the mess to keep it simple. And as I talk today of just transitions and transitions, by just transition I mean framework for justice, research, policy action in narrowly low carbon or more broadly environmental sustainability transitions. Coming from the socio-technical transition studies background, understanding that when we have environmentally burdening agri-food systems that need to be transitioned to more sustainable ones, we have various, usually unlinear transition pathways that also evoke numerous questions related to justice, starting from the who win, who lose, what are the injustices, who can have a say. The themes regarding which we have today and tomorrow, lots of very concrete actual examples, so I'm deliberately staying a little bit at the higher, generalizing, wrapping up level in my talk today. When I started the project and joined the project, it started a very important personal journey regarding the question that what is philosophy actually needed for? Because to put it only a little bit strawman-like form, I think that in the beginning of the project we had basically 2 opinions. And the philosopher opinion may have been something like that, okay, you bring me the relevant information, give me a little bit of time, and I come out with the solutions and normative proposals. Okay, this is what should be done. And social scientists, modelers, quantifiers, economists, and transdisciplinary people in the project thought something like, okay, you are the philosophers, introduce us some nice concepts, conceptual frameworks, we take and apply them, and then we give the results. That's what is needed. 6 years brought lots of interesting discussions, and I think reciprocal learning about the importance of both sides. And how this we got in there, I currently now see it as a matter of dealing with the mess. So when we think about just transitions, I think already today we have learned and heard how diverse and divergent claims, worries, perceptions and expectations there are, and both in research and in the actual society. Very different ideas and also very fragmented research quite often. So we have very interesting case studies or localized, regionalized studies, but how do they come up in the big picture is one of the important questions. And amidst this divergence, diversity and tensions, we have the process laden with numerous tensions between various conceptions of justice and goods. For example, short versus long-term good. A really good example of a case in point, dietary transitions to more plant-based eating. In long term, good for the planet, good for the human health, good for the animals. In short term, lots of concerns regarding farmer livelihoods, regional viability, socio-cultural classes. Tensions also come frequently up between local versus global goods. Predictability of policies, give us enough time, make small enough incremental changes so that we have time to adapt versus the urgency of the environmental crisis. And also inclusiveness into procedures and planning versus the urgency. And finally, not conclusively, comparability of different contributions and whether different parties meet the demands versus flexibility regarding the means and measures to actually do what would be locally most suitable. And risks of this mess are twofold. First, if we try to deal with all the claims, we might water down the transition itself. We never get into the sustainable, environmentally sustainable systems. Or we might get to the transition quite far there, but we forget, distort or merely band-aid justice so that we address some little things, do tiny checkboxes, but actually the really big or most fundamental justice questions remain totally unaddressed, or they get into some kind of minor role that okay, we are not able to discuss or deal with these anyway. And so, in quite the beginning of the project, as I already mentioned, philosophy training is strong in providing normative ethics, for example, actual recommendations on what to do. And this would have also been sort of Plato's approach to the problem. Plato wasn't a big fan of democracy because he thought that citizens are basically incapable of making good decisions. So give that to experts and philosophers. But actually, if we look at the pragmatic side, I'm pretty sure you already understand what is the problem in this. But also on the theoretical side, if we speak about justice, include the recognition and procedural justice, this kind of solution would be contradictory to justice. So something else is needed. And what our project sort of started with, by applying this very familiar to most of us kind of understanding of just transition dimensions, distribution, recognition, procedural and restorative justice there as an addition for just transitions. So this is kind of the first step for trying to make sense of the claims and tensions. And then what happens is that, okay, we get these different partly overlapping dimensions and we can put position findings, concerns there alongside. But first of all, this doesn't help yet very far in kind of actually dealing with prioritizing those, etc. And one central problem that we got a little bit dissatisfied with these dimensions was the idea that it seemed that actually only the concerns that somehow fit into dominant ideas of legitimate discourse, legitimate concern, legitimate issue framing would make their way there. And then there were other voices that quite didn't fit in as nicely, or they didn't get their voices heard in different discussions because they were already marginalized and oppressed. So the usual framework does not yet pay any attention to who are actually having a say and who are not and why. These bubbles in orange might represent, let's say, indigenous people, women, children and youth, non-human entities. So that is something that concerned us. We tried to do something about it, and we came up with updated dimensions of justice, in which the very important addition was that we made explicitly visible the question of justice to whom by introducing beyond the people here and now, cosmopolitan justice, distant and future people, including children and youth, and ecological integrity and justice to animals, non-human entities. I tried to get ecological justice broadly said in, but that was not accepted yet as an idea. So we had definitely disagreements. And what we also did is that we actually incorporated and suggested that capacities would, analytically speaking, deserve separate attention, because actually by paying attention to the currently differential capacities of people or groups to engage in transitions, if we address those early on, we can actually already alleviate the potential injustices that policies and actions might bring about. So it's sort of, how would I say, much more proactive perspective than the restorative justice, and paying attention to capacity building reduces the need for restorative measures and might also very much help address some of the resistance issues that stem from the currently perceived injustices that are partly related to so unequal capacities of actors to act. So we got this updated framework of additional dimensions of justice, and the research team was quite productive in applying and using either the simpler or the enriched framework. Probably forgot some of the works, sorry for that, but really many, and it was useful, lots of knowledge gains with these frameworks, and it was interesting to learn different things. And also here in today's presentations, for example, I think that it is very interesting that the recognition becomes, whenever you go and interview farmers, recognition comes really as one of the core issues. So that is something that is important. Also, we have found that when you interview or ask the views of the most powerful ones, distributive dimensions, cost-benefit analysis get highlighted, whereas the marginalized groups, if you get to interview them, they highlight recognition and procedural matters. Lots of interesting things I cannot discuss more here, but I hope you make good questions about those findings, so we can happy to continue on those. But so this is very important and relevant kind of work, doing empirical studies around the just transition questions. But there are also some, I think, important or relevant risks that have not been quite given attention that they are needed. And this is one of the points where the philosopher with more critical and what about this, what about that questions and reflexive questions and tools might help shed light and bring attention to. I'll introduce two types of these buts or problems. And the first regards studying justice perceptions of different stakeholders. First of all, especially if we do surveys and quantitative studies, but also if we do interview types of data collection, these may reproduce and confirm the current patterns of domination. You can imagine a strongly androcentric society, or a racist society, Eurocentric society. So what is currently legitimate and dominant conception becomes sort of articulated by these kinds of interviews. And it's an important finding, but whether that is something to be communicated also to policymakers that, okay, this is how just transition should happen and this is what justice should look like, that is a good question, given the forms of oppression that we still have in society. And this also includes injustice upholding conceptions of good. Fisher and colleagues, for example, in Sweden found out that the emphasis on the individual positive freedoms was spelled out quite forcefully as very central to justice. So, and you can imagine the problems with those kinds of views possibly. Of course, the question is now that what if we just take the vulnerable and marginalized groups in? Yes, basically that's the ideal, but at least in our project, and we heard actually from you earlier how, for example, even engaging women requires some really extra effort. So, and for example, in our project, we try to get to interview vulnerable groups or their representatives, and it required lots of work to convince them that their knowledge is relevant to just full system transitions. They thought that it's kind of field of the usual suspects, stakeholder experts, those who are speaking in the media already. So it's really a challenge on its own. Also, we all tend to have a little bit of tendency, or more of tendency, of nearsightedness, and this also creates risk of recipient misrecognition. And for example, in our team, Huttunen and colleagues found out, studying the justice framings in the Finnish food system, that there's a really strong tendency of kind of state territorial framings. It's mostly about domestic justice, not so much about what would happen globally. So these kinds of considerations have repeated also elsewhere, to my knowledge, and also regarding temporal aspects. It's people here and now, not that much of future generations. And finally, the cognitive bias issue that comes from psychology, represented in the figure. So basically, in psychological studies, when people were given, let's say, 100 euros, and then some time passed, and they had to give 100 euros back, basically, mathematically, plus minus zero, but they perceived that the loss was much greater than the gain that they received. And when we consider the currently non-ideal world, where we have lots of actually unjustly, unsustainably gained privileges, some of which should be given away, it might be that these appear as really significant losses, and it kind of disturbs our perceptions of justice. Let's go to another type of research challenge when we do empirical research. This goes a little bit more to the quantitative side, and this is mainly based on my experience with seeing some research from our team members before discussions, and also seeing some other survey-like studies and modeling. So there is a risk that when people just take these nice conceptual frameworks into application without having the deeper understanding or philosopher to discuss during lunch breaks, things are over-interpreted as justice issues, even if they are not. There are lots of disparities, speaking of numbers, that don't relate to justice issues. Not every small disparity in nutritional intake of something, or even in income, is a matter of justice, or regional GDP developments. There needs to be a little bit more dive to say whether it's about justice or not. Disparities that concern justice-relevant issues, but don't actually cross significant thresholds what would matter for justice, even if this is of course debatable. And of course one risk is the way, even if they have full prospects to reach well-being and societal participation, their losses are relatively and absolutely greater than those who have very little, because they have very little to lose. And of course, sometimes even the risk of reading justness from good averages, like when you compare how different regions or countries or socioeconomic groups are doing. So more precision is needed by, for example, philosophical work or reflection to think what is actually content-wise relevant for justice and what is threshold-wise relevant for justice. And this is what we try to do kind of as a next step in the process, to bring more content to sense-making. And this meant basically translating those very general dimensions of justice into just food system transition principles and criteria. These principles were more general, there were 7 of them, and criteria were the very food system specific concrete standards. And those kinds of things can take either the lighthouse or sea level form, which I think was kind of a valuable, how would I say, valuable additional point for many social scientists and economists to make sense of what justice means or doesn't mean. So by lighthouse I mean the ideal understanding of justice, perhaps unachievable objective, something that would be perfectly just, anyway something that we should strive towards, whether or not we are about to achieve it, whereas the sea level is the minimum of justice. Nobody should be left under the sea level and let them drown. So these of course are very different understandings in philosophical traditions. And regarding the principles, we then came up with 7 principles for just transitions, and this kind of made the previously introduced enriched dimensions into a little bit more contentful aspects. You can see, for example, that we actually from distributive justice we went into right to vital goods, including food security and labor justice and livelihood related aspects, for example. And what was interesting spin-off from this academic exercise is that we actually got to create a free online tool for stakeholders. We got public administration, NGOs, school food professionals and corporations to use and try this tool. And it was sort of interesting to see that actually corporations were quite excited in the testing round, for example. The challenge was that the feedback in this is that even kind of this relatively simple application to do it lightly but properly takes like 2 hours, and we still live in a society where people respond that okay, this is really great, but 2 hours for justice is quite much. So I don't know what to do about that. But it was anyway a nice example of how actors actually were really interested in this work. Of the criteria, I won't show them all, there were almost 20 of them, but just to show the logic of the criteria that we proposed to bring more content and more standards for Just Agrifood Transitions. The first one regards right to food. Here you see farmer livelihoods. So these are basically normative, openly normative statements about what just transition should or should not do. Global justice, cosmopolitan justice, justice to animals, recognition justice, Of course, here, for example, what counts as giving a voice is still open to much of the debating and contestation. But anyway, you get that explicitly articulated out. And regarding capacity building, that is where, for example, the innovations we have already heard about step in, and, for example, more fair access to innovations, and also people's capacities to collective action. So these were designed to be used either as open normative proposals, something that applied ethics very often does, so that others then either agree or challenge them, criticize them, and develop a better set of normative proposals, but also a sort of a descriptive menu that stakeholders can use as a tool to discuss about just transitions. So that when they think about just transition, they get some suggestions what kinds of diverse perspectives might fit in, so that it's not only their evident kind of what is related to my profession and my closest concerns view, but broadens hopefully a little bit. And this is what turned out to be interesting and challenging in stakeholder discussions, because not all people are so happy to kind of adopt a broader view of justice than what they currently feel as important. And it may be alright, but it's something that should be made kind of somehow more visible and open in the discussions. So then we had these principles and criteria. But what happens now is that still, regardless of the, except for criteria, but there were 20 of them, so that's a little bit too much. Now we were able to map findings a little bit more nuanced, but still, this kind of, while this helps perhaps in sense making, what is justice about, what are all the issues in the big sets, how we can say perhaps that this group seems to only emphasize these points while the other groups emphasize these points, and both have several blind spots. But how to actually navigate this kind of mess? That was still a question that remained kind of very problematic to me. And I think here, if I had done only philosophy in the project, I might have had different or more naive views, although actually in the EurSafe congresses I also always learn so much that perhaps that would have helped me to broaden my understanding. But nevertheless, as a social scientist, when I actually got into the interview contents with farmers, food system stakeholders, from industry to policymakers to consumers, consumer interest organizations, I sort of had quite a hard hit by this diversity and the messiness of these different views and contestations. And I felt that if, as a philosopher, if I try to say nothing more about it, I'm a little bit dissatisfied about my own work, because if all that is left to just be something being negotiated or publicly deliberated, we still have those hierarchies, exclusions, and invisibilities, patterns of domination that might very easily reproduce themselves. So, sort of to get into navigation of the mess, which also then comes very much to the governance questions. Governance alone is not equipped to navigate the mess in just and effective ways. There are so many problems. I'm not trying to address them. I think that Matthias, you will talk about some of those things tomorrow regarding the siloing and fragmentation. There are also various process hierarchies, lack of resources, etc. So there really is the risk of watering down the transition or distorting or band-aiding justice there. So I was thinking that could we somehow also conceptually and theoretically speaking get best from both worlds, the kind of more empirical side and the one that speaks of kind of subjective justice, that is perceptions, expectations of any stakeholders, and the side of objective justice, that is the normative philosophy that suggests itself being capable of providing some useful reasoning about this. And for this question, surely there are lots of answers, but here is one. And it became a proposal for plurality within limits. And that proposal is just transition boundaries. And just transition boundaries basically starts with noticing that there are the people facing the mess. And here we have the agri-food system, broadly speaking, that needs to transition within the ecological ceiling. Ecological ceiling in this proposal comprises of two of the most critical planetary boundaries, climate and biodiversity related ones. Because if we don't get environmental impacts within those safety boundaries for human action, any conception of safe human existence and development and good life is in the future threatened. So this is sort of an existential question and puts quite the absolute ecological ceiling. In other words, any ideas of just transition must mean transition in a way that actually is compatible with projects and developments leading inside these boundaries. There is no just transition if there is no transition in the first place. So this was one of the boundary conditions, but that's not enough. We have to just. And for the just to go onto the threshold side, we drew not only on the donut economic frameworks that some of you might have enforced so far, but also on the human rights as the most broadly universally accepted set of some social minimums. And the argument for social minimum sets was that other goods, any other values and conceptions of good life or additional elements of justice don't matter unless basic needs and security are first met. The article adds some detail what this means, including material but also some immaterial basic rights. So any idea of just transition must include and be compatible with the understanding of justice that pays attention to guaranteeing these social minimums. And between these, after these are guaranteed, there is ample room or space for different transition pathways and visions that are justifiable in this boundary view. And then, within these boundaries, transitions can and ought to take community-specific shapes and forms which are to be deliberated in communities according to their valuations, conceptions of good, and their own priorities for justice. And in this kind of setting, I didn't now put all the bubbles anymore in the picture, but we can also try to make sense in an additional sense that we actually have the normative power to say that certain visions of just transition, that some of those like some multinational corporations, for example, are unjustifiable because they don't adhere to these ecological ceiling and social minimum boundaries. And there are lots of legitimate claims that fit in these boundaries and that are very important to make sense together and put into action. And that is also where these different approaches for co-production of knowledge and governance, transdisciplinary research and other forms of stakeholder involvement, including living labs, action research, etc., have lots to search and explore and produce understanding about. Thank you for your attention.